World War I also brings about constitutional issues in the United States. How are anti-war activists supposed to be treated? How are suspected communists supposed to be treated? Communism and the fear of it was on the rise after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. So these are all issues that come up as a result of World War I. After the war, Woodrow Wilson proposes the 14 points of peace. This is one of the biggest things he's remembered for as President of the United States. He wants to end the practice of secret treaties, so nations signing treaties with each other, must be made public. He wants every nation's right to freedom of the seas to be recognized. This would prevent things like unrestricted submarine warfare to take place again. He wants to reduce the stockpiling of weapons. He wants border changes to nations like Austria-Hungary, like letting Austria and Hungary to be separate nations if they so desired. Biggest piece is he wanted to establish the League of Nations as a body of nations that would help keep peace in the world. This is very similar to the modern United Nations, where people will diplomatically discuss issues to prevent war. And he also wants that League of Nations to be in control of the colonies of European countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This is Woodrow Wilson here with other European leaders as they negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. So, the League of Nations is developed throughout 1919 and 1920. Wilson meets major resistance among Republicans back at home because the structure of the League of Nations said that all members would protect and defend each other. And that sounded a lot like the alliance structure that had caused World War I to erupt to begin with. So Wilson, a Democrat, is seeing a ton of resistance from Republicans back at home. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, a Republican from Massachusetts, proposed an approval of the treaty that would establish U.S. membership in the League with reservations, so it would change language of the treaty, to assure that the U.S. would not be drawn into a war. Wilson encouraged Democrats to vote against the Lodge version of the treaty, which made a 2/3 vote to approve the treaty impossible. And, in the end, the United States is the only nation not to approve of the League of Nations, even though its president proposed it. And if you look at the note of Wilson encouraging Democrats to vote against Lodge's version of the treaty, which was the more popular version that probably would have passed, it's the president who proposed the League of Nations who then kills the League of Nations in the sense of U.S. membership to it. So, a very odd situation indeed. This is a cartoon as World War II develops, and this large man in the center depicts Benito Mussolini. You can see off to the left a young Adolf Hitler, and British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain is depicted by the skinny bald man in the upper left. And Mussolini is saying, "The League? Pah! The League is contemptible. The League can do nothing." And the woman on the right holding a document talking about rights and wrongs. And she's saying, "But aren't you the League?" Meaning, aren't you members of the League? So, obviously the League of Nations did not work out because people like Mussolini and Hitler still were able to come to power, still were able to stockpile weapons, and still were able to start World War II. So the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 and the League of Nations and its negotiation immediately followed this. Wilson calls for a fair peace through his 14 points, one of which was the League of Nations. But European nations like Britain and France wanted revenge. Germany and Austria-Hungary had destroyed much of Europe, and Britain and France wanted them to pay. They wanted them to be punished. In the end, revenge is what is part of the terms. Germany and Austria-Hungary had to accept full responsibility for the war, having started at all. Both nations, but mostly Germany, would be forced to pay massive war reparations, which is debt payments, to the Allied powers to pay for the costs of the war. The terms were forced down the throats of the Germans, leaving a very, very bitter taste in their mouth. The negotiations, and I'll show you a photograph here, consisted of the Allied powers dictating everything. You can see the Allied powers sitting at these tables. It is the Germans who are made to stand in the back of the room. They weren't allowed to have a seat at the table, quite literally. And they were not allowed to contribute to the proceedings either. So the Treaty of Versailles is quite a slap in the face to Germany and Austria-Hungary. Issues back at home. One is the draft. Wilson preferred a draft as opposed to asking for volunteers because he thought it was a more efficient way to gather troops very quickly. He also believed it to be more democratic because men of all social classes had to register for the draft. All men between 21 and 30 had to register according to the Selective Service Act passed in May of 1917. Of the 24 million men that age, 2.3 million were drafted into the Army from May 1917 to the end of the war in November 1918. This is a very, very unpopular decision among the people because many of those people drafted had absolutely no desire to go to war. And the theory that goes against Wilson's theory of efficiency via the draft, getting more men quickly. A volunteer force, on the other hand, might be less efficient as far as numbers and the number of people you can quickly gather, but you can guarantee that those who volunteer will be more enthusiastic about their duties than those who had been drafted. So that's the flip side of Wilson's thoughts. The Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917 and 18, respectively. Both acts passed laws that laid down heavy fines and prison sentences for spying and or aiding a wartime enemy. That sounds pretty legitimate, but who gets to decide what is spying? Interfering with the recruitment of soldiers. This will become important in a moment when we discuss a Supreme Court case. Speaking against the government's efforts to sell war bonds. Again, this ties in with this previous. Urging resistance to any U.S. laws. Again, tying in here. All of these seem to be a direct violation of free speech. Using disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the U.S. government, flag, or military. I'm going to circle this one on its own because this is the most glaring violation of the First Amendment. In the modern world today, a Supreme Court case called Texas v. Johnson, which you won't need to know until much later in the school year, but I'm mentioning it now because that court case decided in, I believe, 1989, said that it is considered a protected right of protest to burn or desecrate the American flag in protest. But in this time period, things as simple as profane or scurrilous language can get you thrown in jail. The U.S. Post Office could destroy anti-war mailings. Again, a violation of the First Amendment. Wow. The only piece of this to me that sounds even remotely close to legitimate is convicting someone for spying and or aiding a wartime enemy. But I'll repeat, who gets to decide what is considered spying or aiding a wartime enemy? Eugene V. Debs, head of the Socialist Party in the U.S., was sentenced to 10 years in prison for making an anti-war speech. Now, I can admit that I would probably wholeheartedly disagree with every single word that ever came out of Eugene V. Debs' mouth because I do not buy into socialist theory. However, there is a famous quote, "I may disagree with what you say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it." That is a very, very famous quote, and for good reason, because everyone has free speech, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with them. This is Eugene V. Debs delivering the address that sent him to prison for 10 years. Shank versus the United States in 1919. This was a war issue that was decided immediately after the conclusion of the war. Charles Shank mailed about 15,000 leaflets to men who had been drafted into the Army and encouraged them to resist the law. After being arrested and convicted under the Espionage Act, Shank appealed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, saying his free speech rights had been violated. And if you ask Mr. Baker, I agree. However, the court upheld his conviction and the constitutionality of the Espionage Act according to the clear and present danger clause of the Constitution. And it is written into the decision of this case that you can't simply shout fire in a crowded theater and expect that that is considered free speech. And they directly compared that, used that as a metaphor, to the fact that Shank was endangering the national security of the United States, was a clear and present danger to the national security of the United States. Therefore, they upheld his conviction and the constitutionality of the Espionage Act. This is Shank. The Red Scare. Like I said, communism after the Bolshevik Revolution became something that Americans were very afraid of. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer authorizes raids against immigrants suspected of disloyalty throughout 1919 and 1920. Before the end of the raids, over 600 people were deported as Reds, which simply means they were radical thinkers who scared the government and the people. So they got deported because of what they had to say. Again, I probably would disagree with absolutely everything that came out of these people's mouths, much like Eugene V. Debs. But I would also fight to the death their right to say it. These things came to be known as the Palmer Raids because of the name of the Attorney General at the time. You can see here some of the newspaper headlines from the time and someone having made a cartoon out of the Palmer Raids and using an anarchist symbol here to show that it's not just people acting lawlessly that can lead to anarchy. It is indeed sometimes the government itself and its actions that can seem like anarchy. That is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you take the online quiz. If you've taken good notes and you use them as you take the quiz, there's really no reason why you can't get a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.